So are you interested in trying to come up with new ways of using your stencils and your masks in your creative projects? Today I want to share with you a new stencil and mask combination that I got and some of the unique ways you can pair these together to create really unique original pages. If we haven't met yet, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So let's get started. So what's the difference between masks and stencils? Really, a stencil allows you to see the positive image. So when you add paint through it, you're going to see the positive image. With masks, you're going to see the area around the image, so the negative image. But what I have here is a stencil that has both the positive and negative image in the same stencil. And this is one I purchased last week. And what I like about StencilGirl is they do a lot of these positive and negative masking and stencil combinations. And what that allows you to do is allows you to change things up a little bit and create some really unique combinations in your art journal. This is another one I purchased a while back that I do use quite a bit. Not on my channel so far, but I've used in my own personal work, where again, you have the overall image. So this is your positive image and this is your negative image. But what's interesting about this image is this is a stencil in itself because it shows some areas of detail that you would normally not see if you were just using a positive image. So I'm starting with just a couple random backgrounds in my art journal. These are ones where I was cleaning a stamp off and ended up adding that on, and then I add just a layer of watercolor on top of this. This is going to be a good place to start. I usually like to start with a little bit of color on my surface. So one of my favorite things to do with masks is just to lay them down on my surface and then spray over top of them. The key to this is having a really interesting background to start with. So I already had some stamped images. I added in some watercolor, and now I'm basically going to add in some spray paint. And this spray paint is by Pebeo, and it's one of my favorite ones that I like to use. And I'm just going to be basically spraying across the top. And this is where you could play around with having multiple colors too. At this point, I'm going to stick with mostly just black. Give it a good shake. So I'm going to have a fairly contrasting background here, but this is also where, if you really wanted to, you could come in and add in a few areas of this lilac, just to mix things up. It kind of comes down to what kind of look that you want. With this one, I think it's going to work pretty well because I have a lot of the black, but then the lilac's just going to give it a few little hints of color. And the key to these spray paints is make sure you shake them really well. Otherwise, they're not going to work very well. But then what do? We move this off to the side. So once we actually get this color down, the next thing we want to do is basically pull up the masks onto our background. And this is a way that you can add masks two different ways. So I've pulled that one up. It looks really amazing. I'm just going to flip it and drop it. And take the second one and flip it and drop it down as well. And this is where I'm just going to just take a towel. I happen to have a towel on hand. You could take a piece of paper to do this as well. And I'm just going to transfer as evenly as possible the amount of paint that you have down on the surface. But now I can pull this up. And so some areas transfer better than others. And so that transfer wasn't as good as a few of the other transfers I've had. And some of that has to do with the background that I chose. So what you do in this situation, you can just add more color onto your mask. And I'm just going to be using a sponge this time to show you that you can use it with any sort of paint. It doesn't have to be spray paint. I just find that spray paint works because it stays pretty liquid. And so I'm just trying to do this as quickly as possible. And I'm trying to water this down a little bit as well, just to have it work a little bit better. And I'm just going to actually come in with maybe a little bit of this pink. I'm just pulling colors off of my palette. Honestly, when I first did this, I got a really good image that was pretty much perfect and I could use it. But now that we have one that's a little less perfect, now I'm playing around with, well, let's see how we can recover this. And that's why I like showing you sometimes when things don't go quite according to plan or don't work the same way as my test. I want to show you what we can do to try to come up with a different variation that maybe works a little bit better. And so I'm purposely not lining those up perfectly. I take a piece of paper, I'm going to give it a good rub. And even this guy here can end up being something that can be used in another project. And now when I pull this up, I end up again with very light color, but I'm going to be able to work with this a little bit. That one's going to be a little bit more of a experiment as I play around with how I'm going to make this work for me. The other options can come with another color of spray paint. I'm going to add that on. Give that another rub. And that one made actually a little bit more of a mess than I planned on, but that's okay. We're just going to turn it around and put it down one more time and see what we're gonna get. And that's not bad either. I'm gonna do the same thing with this other piece and just see what I end up coming up with. I'm gonna go a little bit lighter because that was a lot of paint. I was not trying to make quite that much mess, and I'm gonna be using my cloth again because my hope is that that will work a bit better for me. So what I'm just trying to do is I'm just trying to get some very loose flowers. I'm trying to get a little bit of contrast here, and I'm trying to use up some of that masking. So with the other one, I think I just waited a little bit too long before transferring it, which is why I kind of ran into things maybe not transferring quite as well as I'd like. But that's going to work. I'm going to play around with that and then turn that into something kind of interesting. And now on this piece of silicone sheet, I'm just going to put that down. And I'm going to add in my cloth again because we're kind of creating a bit of a mono print. We're not using a jelly plate for this, but it's kind of giving you the same look. And there you go. So that's another piece that you could turn into something interesting. You could take this section, turn it into card, or do something else interesting with it. Again, this is all collage fodder we can do something with at a later date. So I know this one looks a little bit messy, but I'm going to turn it into something really nice. You'll see. It just takes a little bit of time sometimes to play with this. I should have probably just stopped at the two that didn't work, but because I've added more, I'm going to play around with this a little bit and try to show you how we can turn this into a really good page at the end of the day. So if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, please click that like button. Anytime you click that like button, that just helps more people see this video, and this really helps me as a small channel just to grow that a little bit quicker. So thank you so much for your support. So I'm going to be grabbing my water container, and if you haven't seen my video about choosing the right water container, this is one of my favorite ones I have. It has 2 areas in it, and I have the link that as well below just so that you have access to that video if you're looking for a really good water bucket, especially one if you like to paint outside. That one's one of my favorites. And so this is where we can spend some time and we can play around with some negative painting. This is going to be a little bit more challenging because I did do this on a resist background, so it's going to be giving me a little bit more trouble, but I want to play around with trying to pull out some of these areas. So we'll see how well this works. Just going to play and see kind of what ends up happening. But that's one way if you ever run into where you've taken away too much of the detail and you're feeling a little bit frustrated with your project, it's not over. You can always play around and see what you can kind of come up with just using white paint. And so basically all I do is just takes a little bit of time and go through all of these spots in between areas. And this is just basically helping bring to the surface some of these red areas. And you can decide if you want all the layers to come out or if you just want parts of the layers to come out, or what areas you maybe want to cover up and what areas maybe you want to leave out. And so for some of these areas, I'm just kind of winging it. I'm not necessarily doing this all perfectly. I'm just trying to come up with kind of a nice background. And again, I'm not putting on super thick paint. I'm allowing a little bit of the color to still come to the surface a little bit because you can see some of the color that's also come through and below, and I'm fine with that. I want it thick enough that it's spreading nicely onto the page, but not so thick that you end up basically covering up any of the detail that you have below. Because I like having a little bit of that blue kind of coming through, a little bit of that color kind of peeking out. And basically I'm just kind of coming around all of these spots. And so this might seem quite fussy to you, and it is, but at the same time I like this because this is a way that I practice my brush control. There's also a way you can just work on getting a little bit better with your paints. For some of these larger areas, move up to a slightly bigger brush. It's going to help you get a little bit faster coverage on this. This is a page that I didn't really have a plan for. I didn't really have any sort of plan for it, actually. I was playing around with some techniques, and it was kind of an open background. And so sometimes what I'll end up doing is if I have these open backgrounds, when I'm doing stuff like this, I'll play around with it, I'll test it, I'll see kind of how it works, and if it ends up turning into something really nice, then it kind of gets kept. If not, I just continue to add a layer and a layer until I come up with a project that I really like. But it's a fun way of playing around with negative painting. And if you've never done negative painting, this is a nice way of getting into it. It's just using these stencil shapes and playing around with it a little bit. I'm not sure how much I love that red bit there. So I'm just, this is where you get have the option to delete things out by just painting around them. And you can go like, oh, actually I don't like that shape. So I'm going to pull that shape out. Oh, I like that shape. I'm going to leave that shape in. And so this is a fun way of just being able to play around with all of those little bits of layers and see what you end up with. Because I already feel like this is improving the look of it. It also gives it a more painterly feel. So even when you have something that maybe you went, I think that kind of went sideways on me, it's not done. We have lots of time to play with it a little bit more and see what we can come up with. So don't ever feel like if you've made a mess of a background, it needs to be thrown out. It can be just another layer to add something else onto. And because I was using a Vaseline resist technique with this one, that's the reason why I'm getting some resisting from some of the paint. And so in a few weeks, I'm going to be sharing with you basically some Vaseline painting. It came from a live class that I did, and the students were having moments of, I'm not going to remember all the techniques, would you mind videoing it? So I said I would. So you'll be seeing that in a few weeks as well too, because it's a fun technique. It's one that I've taught a few times, and I thought maybe I would share with you online just so that you have some ideas on how you can use Vaseline to create really cool resist techniques with paint. Well, there you go. So what I've done is I decided that I was going to keep the areas that were black, the areas that were red, some of the areas of the gold. I was not going to fill in the flowers. I wanted to have this to be really contrasting, but you can see with the negative painting, it gives it a completely different look. It's completely different than any of the other stenciled images that I've used so far. So this is what I wanted to play with, was the idea that even if you have something that maybe seems like it's gone sideways, you can do things like negative painting. I usually like to start with a little bit of color on my surface, and now I'm gonna go and add in my stenciled image. And so for this image, I could definitely do it all one color, but I wanna play around with the idea of having the areas of the flowers being more pinky red colored and the areas of the leaves being more green. And the reason for that is I'm going to be coming in later on with some of these details, and I want to be able to play around with this a little bit more. So I'm going to try to stick with colors that work. You could also use some more neutral colors like black or gold or something else if that's what you want to do. And in this case, I'm going to leave out this little image here. That one, I like it, but it's not really going to work for where I want this page to go. And so I'm just adding in a little bit of this color to my sponge. I'm not trying to add it in super thick. I'm just looking to cover the surface nicely, and I'm just dabbing. I find that if I dab with a sponge like this, I usually get really good coverage, and it doesn't make too much of a mess. You want to make sure that you're not having it fall underneath the surface, and that's one thing that I ran into when I was first learning how to use sponges with stencils, is I would add way too much paint. The idea is just to go on very lightly. And these stem areas are always going to be a little hard, so don't be surprised if they end up overlapping with some other areas. We can clean things up later. Like, that's not the point of this. Because this one is a stencil that has multiple colors that I want to add in it, because I want the variation between the flowers and the green stems. I'm just handling this one a little bit differently than I would normally do for a stencil that would maybe be better with just one color. I'm going to also add a little bit of gold onto my surface here. I'm trying to think about some of the shading that I already want to try to create on this layer. Again, everything's staying pretty much in place, so I'm going to add a few little highlights, maybe some bright spots, because I don't want this all to be one color. And this is one way where you can play around with stencils, and stencils can add some pretty good base color just to start. And then from there, you can look at adding in details, adding in other things depending on the look you want. This is also where I could come into some of these areas with a little bit of gold. And even on those bright spots, if you want some little highlights, it just adds in some color and variation, and depending on what you're looking to do, this can add in just some fun look to how you're creating these first layers of your stencil. If you find that your sponge ends up getting a little bit too thick or your paint gets too thick, you can always just add in just a touch of water to it. That's going to thin your paint a little bit. It's going to allow it to move a little bit easier on your surface. If you're finding you're having a bit of trouble, that's also another way you can fix it. So I'm going to grab a clean sponge, and I'm coming in with the red. And you can see my red is pretty thick. So this is where I'm just going to touch it into my water pot. And I'm just going to just touch just the edge of that sponge. You do not want a ton of paint on this. You want just enough to get the paint moving a little bit easier. It should have some nice flow to it. I am using a heavier body paint, so I'm going to run into that a little bit more. If you're using a craft paint, it shouldn't be a problem. And then this is also where you can just adjust the sponge and squish it a little bit, just to make sure that it stays in the area that you want and try to keep it away from some of those green areas. If you end up with a little bit of overlap, don't worry about it. You can always paint in some areas later and adjust things, but we're trying to be as specific as possible with where we're adding in our color here. I'm also going to add in like a few areas of the pink as well. You can choose whether or not you want everything really bright red or if you want to add in a little bit of pink. It really is personal choice. So you can see that this area has slipped a little bit. So what I'm doing is, now that I've done this leaf, which I know is exactly where I want it to be, I'm going to shift this back over slightly to get it to sit where it's supposed to, so that those flowers are lined up. And as long as we don't press down on that, we shouldn't have any paint get over the bottom of the stencil. So as long as you aren't putting in super thick layers of paint, there's no reason you can't shift the stencil if you do what I did, which was unfortunately get a little bit of movement going on that you didn't want. I am working with a lot of my older paint for this project. It's been an ongoing goal of mine to use up a bunch of my old paint. I recently rearranged my art space and realized how much of everything I have. So I've been trying to work through the things I already own, and then I will eventually go buy new stuff when I finally use it all up. Stay tuned. In a few weeks, I'm still working on the editing of it, but I'm going to be sharing a whole bunch of videos about how to organize your art space and some of the psychology behind it too, because I know for myself, I had to have some pretty honest conversations with myself about how I want to organize things and what do I want from my space moving forward, because it's so easy to consume. It's just sometimes it's making sure that you end up with an art space that really works for you and lets you be creative in the way you want to be creative. And I want these generally a little bit more red than I want them pink, but I don't mind a little bit of pink in there because it's kind of good to have a little bit of variation in color there. So now when I lift that up, you can see I have a general shape of flowers and leaves. And then from here, we're going to be adding in other layers as it dries, but this is basically our first layer as we're playing around with this piece. So you might notice after a while, these stencils get a little bit grungy. That is just the nature of it. I do use a nail brush to carefully clean off the really easy to remove paint, but I'm trying not to damage these masks just because they are fairly delicate, and if you wreck them, they're not really going to bend back the way you've had them before. And so now I'm just basically lining these up. So you can see that in areas, we have areas that are now still visible. So now we can play around with adding in more color. Instead of just sticking with just like one color or two colors, now we can add in a few more colors to our background. So basically I'm just using a flat brush. Find one that you're maybe a little less attached to for this part of the project, and it's going to leave us the edges where we're not covering up the edges, but we're going to cover up these middle sections. So this is where you could start playing around with a little bit of color. This is where I could bring in a little bit of white and add it there along the edges to create maybe little bits of pink in there. You want to think about where you want to actually have your color. Do you want to have it really contrasty? Do you want really dark? Do you want it really light? And so I'm just going to add in a few little spots like that. So the areas of the leaves are probably going to be a little bit lighter. And with this stencil, I found it a little bit harder. I found compared to some of the other ones, when I draw, it's a little bit easier to figure out what they're trying to do with the angle and the direction. With this one, I found it a little bit more challenging. So I'm kind of playing it by ear and figuring out maybe what I like to see. I'm just going to, again, smudge those nicely together. Add in a little bit of texture, and I'm okay with a little bit of added texture there. And probably along the bottom here, I'm going to add in a little bit of this red ochre color, just because that's going to be a little bit deeper along that bottom area. And this is where I can lift up and take a look. And I'm liking where that's going. I'm going to maybe add in a little bit more white, create a little bit more contrast than what I have there, just because I'm looking at it going like I do want a little bit more contrast going on. And this is also where you could maybe play around a little bit with your paintbrush. And this is also where you could play with using in other colors as well too, because a red flower could also have some areas of just really light yellow. So you could mix in a little bit of white and yellow together to get more of a really bright light yellow. And you could look at maybe adding in areas. Maybe you make this more like a tulip, where sometimes the tulip areas have areas that are lighter along the bottom and get moved into color up above. I am moving more in a brushstroke manner. The key to this is making sure that you are going very light. You're not pulling it underneath the stencil, but you're still kind of keeping it on top where you want it. And as this yellow's drying, it's getting a little bit more muted. So I'm going to come in with a little bit more white. And it's going to add in another layer on top as well. But this is also where you can play around with getting quite a bit of variation in those layers. So now when I pull this up, now I have a lot more texture and a lot more interest in. They have this more painterly flower feel to them. So I love these two pages kind of as they are, but we also have some options here. This one I'm going to leave the way it is, but if you wanted a little bit more detail, so this one I've done is basically outlined all of the images in white paint pen. So we have this is a little bit softer that has nice edges. This is a great way you could leave it here, or you could look at adding in a little bit more detail. It really is up to you and what you like. I actually like both of them for different reasons. And this is also a place where you could look at adding in some journaling in behind. You could look at adding some other layers, some collage, some other things, or just leave this page as is. And the other option is to play around with adding in some more details with this. So this is one that I did where I didn't really like how the flowers were. I had only done the one layer and I was playing around with adding more layers, and I decided just to add in my own painterly flowers and added in a lot of my own sketching. With this one, we could do something similar. Like we could basically come in and look at some of these flowers and just bring in our pen. I'm using a Placer fountain pen that has carbon ink in it. So this is completely waterproof ink. And this is also where we could kind of come in and we could do really fun, loose lines. Instead of having something that looks extremely realistic, I am looking at playing around with these edges and just adding in a little bit of variations. And so this is a way you can just basically add in scribbles, add in things, just to make these feel a little bit more defined than maybe where you already were with these. And this is why I like actually using a fountain pen with carbon ink in it. I love my other pens, but what I found is when I was doing this on the other layout, I killed 3 pens in a matter of a couple hours. So I don't really want that to be happening again. So what I've decided to do is basically fill this with carbon ink. And what nice thing about carbon ink is it's basically waterproof. And I'll leave you links below for where you can get some of these. They work really, really well for this type of stuff because then it doesn't matter how much paint I have on the surface, doesn't matter how hard I am on the pen. I can usually get it unclogged, get it working again, and it works really, really well. And yeah, so that kind of gives a little bit more detail than what I had. This one here, I actually started by outlining the whole thing, and then I realized I didn't really love it, so I started painting in things. Well, this one here, I've basically done all the painting first and then added things on top. So I hope you've enjoyed these different techniques we've tried today. They do range in style and in type, and I do hope that you get some inspiration from this. This is a little bit looser than what I usually do, but I hope that you do enjoy these techniques. And again, you don't have to leave them just as they are. You can add other layers. You can add other focal imagery to this, even if you wanted to go in that direction. But I wanted to show you something that was a little bit fun, a little bit loose, and will hopefully inspire you to get creating. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you're looking for any of the supplies I used today, look at the description below. I have all the materials there. So if you're looking for another video about how to use stencils and spray paints in your art journal, click here. This is when I went over how to use spray inks and spray paints together in your art journal. So I'll see you in that next video.